My first question, this is a personal question, but what is it like growing up in a Bulgarian household?
Yeah, it's funny. Even though I ended up obviously like moving to the States when I was like 3.5, 4 years old, I still very much so like grew up in a very, sort of Bulgarian way. Both obviously at home, primarily spoken language is Bulgarian. My parents are very much so Bulgarian, right? Like, they were, born and raised, college, et cetera, all there. And the United States was a very, sort of foreign nation to them. Um, and then even as a kid, like every summer, I was basically sent out to Bulgaria for the full summer, out to my grandparents' farm in the middle of nowhere. And so most of my like favorite childhood memories are all like in Bulgaria as well. 'Cause it's like the United States was basically just schooling. Bulgaria was where all the fun stuff was. Um, but yeah, I think it's a unique way to grow up that gives you a lot of appreciation for obviously a very different culture than what the United States has, and so it makes you realize that what the United States has is both very special but also very different than what the rest of the world looks like. Bulgaria also, similar to a lot of other Eastern European countries, but I think especially so, like values, sort of mathematics and physics more so than almost anything else in terms of, educational background. Computer science probably bundled into that as well. And so because of that, I was, at home, probably learning 2 to 3x more math, at home than I ever was, at school. I remember like, senior year of high school, I took this class called IB upper or IB something mathematics. It's like the International Baccalaureate program. And I remember as like we got like midway through the year and we were doing some like combinatorics problems, the teacher was, asking like, hey, like, you don't seem like you pay much attention or study or whatever. And I was like, I literally, these problem sets that we're doing, like I did in sixth grade. But yes, even in the summers when I was in Bulgaria, I think like it was a summer between my seventh and eighth grade year. My dad, because he'd been formerly on the national math team in Bulgaria, stuck me into like the national math team's like summer preparation camp, which was, Lord, that was intense. Doing extremely high level math, but also in like not English, while you're eighth grade, and also by the way, everybody else there was like 10th, 11th, 12th grade. So you're also like you're 3 years younger. It's not your native, or like it's not the native, not the language that you speak in school at the very least. So I'd never really done math at that level in Bulgarian, and also you're just completely isolated in like the like mountains of Bulgaria. So that was intense. That was intense to say the least.
What's your fondest memory then? I know you went back. You talked about the beaches in Bulgaria, some of the parties that you would go to, and then you'd have like a math competition the next morning and stuff like that. But what do you kind of look fondly back on in that part of your life?
I think just like the level of like independence and just like the, sort of forceful push into, becoming, an adult, probably I feel like a lot, sooner than like I think most Americans really start to feel like an adult. Like, there's, summers in Bulgaria, it was just like, almost effectively unsupervised. You're just like in these like, massive, like, math camps where, you just have like a, daily budget on what you can go do. But like, I was out like clubbing, until 2 o'clock in the morning and then, had to, go get my work done and, wake up the next morning for the math classes. And I think most Americans when they're like, 13, 14 are still like treated like children versus, Bulgaria, people basically consider you an adult. You can buy alcohol, you can go to bars, you can go out. It's maybe changed a little bit, now it's joined the EU, but not too different.
Not too different. Okay, that's cool though. Well, you're in Miami now. You lived in the Bay Area for I'm not too sure how long, but it was a significant chunk of time. I think you did like the Square internship there. You did Teespring there. Anyhow, you were in California for a while. Now you're in Florida. What would you say are some of the biggest differences? Miami's gotten a lot of hype recently from people like Keith Raboy, which who you're very close to. But I want an honest opinion. Like, what's the good side? What's the bad side? And how's it compare to the Bay?
Yeah, I mean, I think Miami to me on a fundamental level just represents a lot more of what the future of the United States does than California. Miami is a majority foreign born population. English is barely the primary language. You constantly on the streets hear everything from like Spanish to Russian to hell even a decent amount of Bulgarian on the streets of Miami. And there's a level of like local political culture that is both very accepting of a wide spectrum of opinions and stances on various issues, as well as just a very sort of pro growth, pro capitalism, pro sort of non-zero sum games. That again, I think ultimately sort of represents what the future of the United States looks like, much more so than San Francisco, which whenever I go back and visit, I'm always just like in complete shock when I like walk the streets of it depends obviously in varies neighborhood to neighborhood, but Lord, if you walk the streets of like the Marina Cow Hollow, Pack Heights, etc. It's like the most like whitewashed city, in the United States. Everybody's basically, looks the same, talks the same, acts the same, votes the same. And, in some ways, like technology sort of very accidentally happened into, being centered in that city for what I consider a relatively, brief period of time. Even pre 2011, technology was not centered in San Francisco, it was centered in, sort of the, South Bay. It basically started to move up to San Francisco as, technology ecosystem grew. Palo Alto, rents sort of became exorbitant. And so San Francisco suddenly became the center. But I'd argue it was really only the center from like 2012 to 2020. Pre that, it was Palo Alto. Post 2020, it's not clear that there's any center today. The only real cons of like Miami is obviously it's still like a more nascent ecosystem, but I think for a year and a half in, it's obviously made phenomenal progress. And as an investor, your whole job is to like project out early progress and predict future results, and feel very confident about the future results. And then there's some amount of the weather patterns are definitely much more interesting to say the least relative to San Francisco. There are definitely times where like a 3 o'clock coffee out in Wynwood, and suddenly starts pouring rain. And here when it pours rain, this isn't like Seattle rain where it's like it's an uncomfortable mist or fog almost, or a little rainy. This is like tropical forest rain. Like these things are large, almost pellets of water coming down. And so if you're outside, you're basically the equivalent of having hopped in the shower within a few minutes of being outside, which is tough. So yeah, other than the like spontaneous weather patterns, it really feels like, for me at least, in my culture, my lifestyle, my work ethic, only strictly cons. I'm like happier, I'm healthier, I'm fitter. I eat food that is much more consistent to Bulgarian cuisine, which ultimately is what my genetics were optimized for thousands of years. My genetics were also optimized for living in a hot and humid environment that is similar to the Mediterranean Sea. And so Miami has all of those things. And so because of that, I end up just being happier and more productive here than I ever was in the Bay Area.
This is a bit of a speculative comment, but what I've noticed is investors are moving there more than the tech companies themselves. And you're right, like we are in the early stages. It is too early to tell. But do you think that is where the tipping point is going to occur, where like the headquarters of some of these, big names are going to move there, that in turn will reflect, higher wages, better jobs, more people will move there as a result. And then it's going to be this continuous cycle of growth as a result?
I think it's unlikely that these types of ecosystems grow from the top down. I think they really grow from the bottom up. And so I think it's unlikely that the thing that makes, Miami successful is like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, et cetera, like opening offices here. Like it's not even clear to me that that's necessarily like the type of talent that, creates a startup ecosystem. Like those people are effectively all like semi-retired and not the most ambitious, in the world. So I think in some ways what's much more important is like, one, obviously investors moving here. That's a lot easier given that investors in some ways are much less geographically bound. Even a mid-stage, company, 30, 40, 50 people, if you've established an office already in a different locale, it's really difficult to like rip and replace and like move the entire team to Miami. I think the thing that's like, most important to track is just like the number of net new founding teams that are being started and companies that are being started in Miami. And I think there's a couple of different leading indicators for that. Like one, what number of founders are moving here? Two, how many companies are being built here that will then spin off proto founders that will be the future, sort of founders. As an example, Keith obviously started Open Store here, has recruited a ton of engineers here. One of the engineers, obviously regretfully, Keith wanted him to stick around, but left after, 8-9 months at the company and decided to start his own company. He chose to build it in Miami, given that this is where a lot of his network is and where he preferred to live. And so in some ways, those first sort of wave of companies that succeed are ultimately, I think, what makes a startup ecosystem. So again, it's much more like bottoms up. I think if you have like sort of $2-3 billion plus outcomes, that's what ultimately makes it sustainable. Where then you have this flywheel effect of like the liquidity from that outcome, the employees that spin off and become proto founders from that outcome. Is that when it really drives the success of the ecosystem? And the fact that like I think Miami's actually got a pretty good shot of that. Of like I know a handful of companies that I think are on their path to being $1 billion plus outcomes. At a year and a half in from really experiencing a massive jolt of energy is not like the worst place to be.
Right.
So
when you were at Khosla in your 7th month, you sourced an aerospace company into the firm. I would love for you to talk about that process, and maybe for people that are interested in getting into venture, what does it actually look like day to day as someone working in that role? Like, what does it mean to be a principal? What does it mean to be a partner?
What that role looks like at like year, 5 as example is very different than year one. By default, I was actually talking about this. We recently, hired a, new partner to the firm, Sam Blonde, joining us from, previously the CRO of Brex. And then before that was the VP of sales at, Zenefits. And so obviously he just joined us, and by default, when you just start at a venture capital firm, you obviously have no portfolio companies because you obviously just started. You never made an investment before. And so it's interesting because like the first year of the role in some ways looks wildly different, where your time is sort of much more unstructured. You're mostly just like, yeah, literally the only job is just spend time with founders and determine like, which ones you enjoy meeting with. And then sometimes get roped into pre-existing portfolio companies where you might have a particularly strategic value add. So obviously Sam is phenomenal at scaling up enterprise sales, and so he gets roped into a handful of those. And so there's sort of the scaled down version. Obviously, I was not at Sam's level of career experience when I joined Khosla Ventures, but on a scaled down level is effectively how I spent my time. I helped the pre-existing portfolio companies with what I could from my prior founding experience, and then I spent a lot of time with sort of founders and companies that I thought were interesting. And then you sort of asked about this company that I invested in 7 months into Khosla Ventures. It was basically my first sort of aerospace investment, and was partially why I decided to stick with venture for the long term, given that sort of aerospace was my core passion, and I realized that venture investing would be a way to do it sort of sooner rather than later. And the way that I met it was literally just like I was, starting to just like network around Silicon Valley, tell people here were my various interests, and that like, because I had this like hobbyist passion for aerospace, I also wanted to turn it into sort of a professional, hobby. And so I would tell people literally any aerospace company that is interested in chatting with Coastal Ventures, I'm happy, to have a discussion, with them. And so ultimately, literally was, grabbing, coffee and Soma with a mutual investor friend. Was telling this, and he was like, "Hey, you should meet this company." And met with them, and I was like, "Oh my god, I think this is going to be a great company. We should have them come in and present to the rest of the partnership." And lo and behold, even though that wasn't really my primary edict in my role at Coastal Ventures to sort of be sourcing and finding investments, we ultimately ended up investing in the company 7 months in, and I got to be sort of involved for the entire journey since. That's kind of how you spend time day to day, at least in the early days, and then obviously further along, as you start to have portfolio companies, it turns into board meetings, helping sell candidates, helping them prepare for future fundraisers. It definitely shifts more to probably like 80% of the venture job becomes supporting the pre-existing portfolio and the management of that, and then only really 20% becomes the sort of net new founder or company meeting.
It seems like roles at VC firms are a little transient in the sense that you can go from one day you're talking about engineering, the next day you're talking about sales. Is it that unstructured, or like do people come in with a specific area of expertise and it's like, okay, this is your job? Similar to how like maybe a traditional finance firm might work. You're focusing on this sector, you're analyzing these types of companies. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely varies, firm to firm. There are some firms that will keep you super narrowly focused on a particular, area that you have expertise in, and then some will allow you to sort of be very broad. That's one thing that I really like about Founders Fund is that it's super broad in terms of expectation. Like nobody's set into like, hey, you are just a consumer investor. Hey, you're just an enterprise investor. Hey, you're just early. You're just growth. It's encouraged to just like do whatever you think is going to generate the highest IRR effectively. And obviously, people have some biases towards what they're going to like sit in. And then the other thing that I like about Founders Fund is we also and obviously we'll talk about this later, allow investors on the team to actually incubate companies. And so, I think a great way of highlighting the diverse set of activities that govern my day is just like, I'll walk you through my, schedule on Friday, which was, I started off the day doing a PR call for Varda. So we just had an announcement, this morning about our drop test campaign. So I was discussing with Payload, the newsletter that we announced it with, how that went. Then it was a founder pitch. Then it was a sort of potential Teal fellow that's asking for Teal fellowship advice. Then it was a co-investor that's moved to Miami and meeting with them. Then it was a net new sort of founder pitch. Then it was a Varda customer call. Then it was a Varda debt provider call. Then it was a one-on-one with somebody at Varda. Then it was back to another net new founder pitch. Then another one-on-one at Varda. And then another sort of net new sort of founder pitch. And even each of those founder pitches, it's like one is like clothing related, one was personal productivity, one was biosecurity. Anyway, so the point being that like even across the topics, widely varied. So on Friday, I did like 15 different activities. It was like comms, biosecurity, clothing, like, literally choose your, sort of extent of, activities. So, um, I love it as somebody who's like super ADD. I love the idea of sort of like, hopping between a million different sort of, topics and, industries and areas over the course of a single day. And I think venture is one of the few jobs that allows you to do so. And in some ways, it's also one of the few jobs in Silicon Valley that I think so actively rewards sort of like lifelong learning, where a lot of being an investor is just constantly reinventing yourself. The trends that were relevant in 2008 are wildly different than the trends that were relevant in 2018 and what will be relevant in 2028. And so you constantly need to be like reinventing yourself and finding what is the next new thing that you're really going to focus on. And ideally, that next new thing is something that most other investors aren't focusing on.
Jumping to that next question, what would you say the biggest difference is between being a founder and a VC? And then what would you say is the most misunderstood aspect of each role?
I think on like the sort of founder to VC side of it. So like, what do founders misunderstand about VCs is that I think I kind of get into this like classic sort of debate with founders, not even debate, but like the classic piece of advice that I almost always have to give is like, you need to present your seed, Series A, Series B, et cetera, round that you're going out and fundraising for, not as, hey, here is why I can use this capital and what I can get done, which is like from the perspective of like, well, I'm a founder, I need money, here's what I can get done with that money. That is not why investors invest. Investors invest because like they want to make a return, and so ultimately the only way to convince an investor that they should invest in you is to present them a financial opportunity that is going to make them returns. And I think sometimes
Right.
people as founders, sort of forget what the primary motivation of venture capitalists is. They end up going out and being like, "Well, I've got this cool piece of technology, and I've got like X, Y, or Z interest, and here's how I could build it, and like therefore give me money and I will build it." And that is not how investors think at all. On the flip side, let's see, what do investors misunderstand about founders the most? I think like there's something about investors probably underappreciating how much of being a successful like founder comes to like being willing to be the janitor in some ways. Like there's just in some ways like the job of the CEO or the founder is like to do all the shit that like nobody else wants to do, or you haven't hired
Right.
somebody to do. And sometimes the stuff that actually makes a company very successful is not particularly, let's say, like glorious. So maybe like over glorification of what founders actually do to make their companies successful, when most of the time it's just like, I need to hire this person, and so I'm literally or this I need to hire for this role, so I'm literally going to spend the next 3 months just doing like 5 hours of phone screens every single day, interviewing people, doing on-sites, taking them out to dinner, etc. And it's like, as a founder, you're basically like an IC recruiter. But in some ways, that can be like the most impactful thing that you can do for the company.
Makes sense. Another hybrid question here, but you mentioned something in the Miami Tech interview about how like Keith did a cohort analysis at Square when you were doing your internship and it blew you away. And I think to me, like this shows that even the smartest people may not know helpful tips and tricks that are industry specific. So going back to like that hybrid, what do you think is something that like for ventures and startups are helpful to kind of know?
Oh man, everybody's gonna have their own bias on it. I obviously come from the world of like a lot of the things that I'm most passionate about are what I consider sort of like more deep tech transformative investments. And I think the thing that people underappreciate there is like people think that the sort of best sort of consumer founder is a party promoter, and that the best sort of deep tech founder is an astrophysics PhD. And it turns out actually the exact opposite is true. The best consumer founder is actually an astrophysics PhD, and the best deep tech founder is actually probably more of a party promoter. The reason being that like if you're a consumer company, you can effectively raise off of the basis of just pure mathematics, right? You can just show here's how many users I'm getting, here's what's the viral factor, here's the payback period, here's the LTV, et cetera. It's like almost effectively like a numbers game. Versus on like the more deep tech side of things, you're not going to necessarily have like standard sort of like revenue metrics, impact, et cetera, that like a SaaS company can raise off of. And typically you're going to be very much so like an N of one company. And so the only way that you can actually convince investors to give you money is through a very effective story that explains, here's the thing that I'm doing, and here's why it's going to be so impactful, and here's why you're ultimately going to make massive returns. Investing significant dollars into a company before there's quote unquote traction. And so I think the thing that people misunderstand the most is probably like when storytelling is most important. And surprisingly enough, it's actually most important with the most technical companies. It's actually not that important with the less technical ones.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's talk about Varda now. Varda is, in my opinion, like a really cool aerospace company. What have been some of the biggest challenges for you when it comes to actually, building your childhood dream? And then I would be curious, like, what advice would you have for non-technical people looking to break into this space because of how technical it can be?
Um, let's see. I think there are a multitude of challenges of bringing something like Varda to life. It requires significant multidisciplinary engineering and trade-offs between the various disciplines, right? The more mass that you put, on board, the more energy that you need to decelerate during the reentry process. Um, uh, the more solar panels you want out so that you bring in sort of energy, the higher the structural load is during the launch process. And so everything sort of comes with these trade-offs that are these like highly complex sort of systems engineering trade-offs, and that like the sort of simple one liner of, hey, let's go manufacture things in space, the sort of complexities underlying the infrastructure that's necessary to make that successful. It's probably orders of magnitude sort of more difficult than I expected, and orders of magnitude sort of more expensive than I expected. So these have probably been like the most difficult parts of it thus far. I think if anything, everything else I'm pretty happy with. The fundraising progress, customer progress, sort of public perception of the company. All of that, I'd say, relatively, according to expectations or according to plan or on the upper end of expectations. Um, but building spacecraft, turns out it's always harder than you expect.
Yeah, space factories are, yeah, they're pretty tough. Do you have any advice for non-technical people looking to break into the industry?
Yeah, any more specific than like breaking into generally any technical industry, which is like obviously even at Varda, we need like finance controllers, we need customer success managers, we need ops, we need facilities, etc. And so if it's a space that you're super passionate about, almost certainly your skill set is still required at an aerospace company, given that we also have the same needs that most traditional companies do. And so I think the biggest feedback would be like, yeah, just dive in and find a role that is at a company that utilizes your skill set. At this point, SpaceX employs whatever. I'm probably not going to remember it off the top of my head, but I think like 12,000 people. Those 12,000 people almost certainly span effectively the entire human species of sort of what skill sets they have and what they work on. And so there's almost certainly a role for you at that scale.
I always wonder, there's always like the building side, the technical challenge, but then there's the regulation side and navigating through all the roadblocks and rules and all those kinds of things that government has in place. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. What did you kind of think about when balancing that duality problem?
I think of it more as like a necessary evil, and that like it didn't really like go into the calculus of should we start the company or not. Given that I think generally if you're doing something that is just like economically beneficial, and for the good of humankind, like you'll figure out how to work with regulators in order to make it happen. It just may require documentation work, etc. But for sure, when we started Varda, in the first week, it was both recruiting aerospace engineers, and then it was, calling up the FAA, FCC, NOAA, et cetera, all the, sort of governing bodies that touch our pieces of work. We're definitely doing some relatively, sort of complicated, net new, sort of operations in terms of, space where, you're going to be regularly re-entering spacecraft from orbit, given that we have to bring our materials back down after we produce them. And we're going to be doing that landing on land versus, up to date, all commercial reentry has happened over the water, and doing that, for sake of both operational simplicity as well as, engineering simplicity that ultimately all translate to cost. And so, it's been sort of great working with these agencies, and I think I've been pleasantly surprised at the level of interest and support that we've gotten in terms of their excitement about the activities that we're looking to pursue. But talk to me, I guess, after we get our first, sort of FAA approval to re-enter our vehicle. We're not quite there yet, but coming up close.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned that like anyone in their career is going to have good days and bad days. They're going to get into ruts and get out of them. Is there anything that you've done to kind of manage that a little bit better? Like, are you a guy that focuses on your diet a lot? You're in pretty good shape. Like, do you exercise a lot? I mean, I remember you talked about in one interview how you got cold feet at one point with Varda, and like maybe you could speak to how you got out of that. What changed? What made you get back on track?
Getting out of the cold feet with Varda was entirely a wife motivated thing. So yeah, that one is a different answer than the first part of your question. I basically was chatting about it with my at the time girlfriend, now wife, and her answer was basically like, Del, you've been thinking about this problem your entire life. You've got the perfect team put together, and you're almost certainly going to be able to raise the capital to do it. Like, why are you even debating this? So yeah, don't know why I was debating it, but sometimes you need somebody that's a very trusted insider, let's say. To make you realize something that's very obvious. And then on the, generally getting out of a rut thing, yeah, I think it's, recognize just like focusing in on the inputs to my, sort of mental and physical health. So everything from, diet, sleep, getting sunshine, all these things, it turns out actually are the things that like determine whether or not you're happy, not, whatever XYZ activity you did that day in relation to work. Like at the end of the day, the thing that actually is going to make you happy in the long term is like the focus on all these like sort of very lizard brain base inputs.
We've got a couple of minutes left. I always like asking people what are they passionate about that they don't get asked about a lot, because startups can be so all consuming.
The current passion is flying planes. I love being up in the air and sort of a free man. There's something just that's very empowering about getting to explore this dear planet and one of the most free ways of exploring it, which is up in the air. And so anytime that I'm not thinking about work or Varda or everything else, my brain naturally drifts back to when can I get back on a plane. And so right now, my next time that I get back on a plane is approximately 15 hours from right now.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for coming on the program.